Welcome to English 2450, COM 2010, Intro to Film, Week 3 Lecture Video Number 1, Visual Design, The Basics. So today I'm going to be talking about what I mean by the term visual design, how it's related to the upcoming topics we'll be talking about over the next couple weeks, and breaking down some of the basic elements of visual design before moving into more specific things in the next videos in the series. So let's start with what is visual design and how is visual design different from cinematography and editing. If you look at the syllabus for the upcoming weeks, this week is visual design, next week is lighting, which is a kind of second part of visual design, and then following that we do cinematography and editing. And you might say, okay, well, aren't all of those things visual? And yeah, of course they are. So the way that I want to think about this in terms of why we have it split up into visual design, cinematography, and then editing is that basically it's how the film looks, how it was filmed, and how it was put back together. So visual design is only dealing with what the film looks like. We're not talking about editing yet. So we're not ready to talk about cuts and takes and things like that quite yet. And we're not talking about what the camera is doing, cinematography, how it's filmed. Is the camera close or far away? What type of film stock is being used? Is the camera stationary or is it mobile? These are all things that we're going to get to very soon. But for right now, I just want to think about when we're looking at the screen, what do we actually see? How does the film look? And this can be broken down into mise-en-scene, lighting, and composition. And those can be broken down into further subcategories as well. Another kind of tricky thing about talking about visual design is that quite often when a film textbook talks about visual design, it does not include digital effects like CGI or motion capture, because those are actually considered a part of cinematography or editing. Now, the reason why digital effects are not considered part of visual design, even though clearly they are visual and they are designed, they're intentional, is because of when digital effects happen in the filmmaking process. If we think back to last week, when I broke down the filmmaking process, digital effects typically happen in post-production. And the rest of visual design happens in pre-production and during the production process. So digital effects are typically talked about a little bit later in this process because they occur later in the filmmaking process. So one thing to think about is when I'm discussing visual design here, I'm specifically talking about the physical, real, material things that we see on the screen. Sometimes CGI is so well done that we can't tell necessarily that a background is real and was photographed on location or on a set versus it was, added or digitally enhanced or altered through the process of CGI. If you're not able to tell if an effect is digital or practical, it's okay to talk about it under the auspices of visual design. Just keep in mind that typically, at least film textbooks, consider digital effects a separate sort of category from visual design, as we're going to be talking about in this video. So, to cover this again briefly, visual design is what we see. Cinematography is how it was filmed. And editing is how it's put together. So let's start with mise-en-scene. Mise-en-scene is a French term that means putting into the scene. And this terminology is actually older than filmmaking. It comes from theater. So it tends to be one that trips students up as far as pronunciation goes. So say it out loud with me a couple times. Mise-en-scene. 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 It's kind of similar to the idea of mise-en-place. Now, if you watch cooking shows, you'll see that chefs always have ingredients portioned out into individual bowls. Their tools are in a specific place. Their hand towels are in a specific place. They know where everything is, right? Mise-en-place for a chef is similar to mise-en-scene for a director. It's making sure that everything is where it's supposed to be and everything is controlled within the environment. So, mise-en-scene refers to the director's control over what we see within the frame of the film. This is the process by which the look of the film is developed and executed. Now, this is done by the director, by the cinematographer, by the production designer, and by all of the people that work within the art department. So this is a collaborative thing. Mise-en-scene cannot happen unless there are a lot of people working together to kind of create the scene that the director and the production designer envision. So in terms of how these things are envisioned and who is doing that envisioning, I know last week we talked a little bit about pre-visualization, the work that's done during pre-production where storyboards and animatics are put together to sketch out and plan carefully how the film is going to look. One important thing to remember here is that randomness does happen, of course, but random occurrences can be edited out of a film. So anything that you see as part of the mise-en-scene is still a choice by the director. So, for example, let's just say a film is being shot on location outdoors. A plastic bag blows by unexpectedly and gets caught in a tree. The director can shout, "Cut," go and remove the plastic bag, shoot over, or edit it out during post. But if the director decides, you know what, I actually like that plastic bag, I want to keep it, then that's a choice that the director has made. So something to remember is that even if an element of the mise-en-scene, what happens within the scene, what we see within the frame, seems random, it is still a choice because the director left it there in the final cut. So in terms of the roles here, I'm talking a lot about the director, but obviously the production designer is a big part of the mise-en-scene, the visual design as well. The production designer role evolved out of the art director role, which was common during the Hollywood studio system. From the 1930s to around the 1960s, when the independent system became more popular, art directors worked for a single studio, and they kind of helped keep the look of films from that studio consistent sort of across the board, which is why you can watch an MGM film from the 1930s, 40s, or 50s and say, yes, this is an MGM film. Sometimes it's because they would reuse sets, they would use props over again, costumes to save money, but also because you would have the same artists working on multiple films for the same studio. So the art director was a really kind of powerful position in the studio system who would make sure that, MGM films looked and felt like MGM films rather than Universal films, for example. Now, production designers, it's a little bit more specific of a role, and they tend to work on films with individual directors where they visualize the overall artistic design of the film. They also supervise the departments that work together to execute that design. They don't just theorize this is what the film should look like. They make sure that the end product looks how they envisioned it in that pre-visualization process. Now, the next thing to think about here is different styles of visual design. And there are three listed here. You have realism, formalism, and classicism, or classical Hollywood. Now, these all exist on a spectrum. They're not totally separate from each other, but it's more like they're kind of just different shades on the same spectrum of visual style. So realism is a style of filmmaking that tries to look like objective reality. It's long takes. It's shooting on location rather than a constructed set. It's using non-professional actors who are kind of low-key in how they deliver their performances, and it means minimal editing. Realism means that the film does not draw attention to its own artifice, its own artificiality. It doesn't say, hey, look at me, I'm a film. I'm going to have these big dance numbers and huge elaborate costumes and beautiful sets and lots of special effects. Realism is more of a reflection of what we expect the everyday to look like. Now, that's different from formalism, in which the beauty of the image is primary. Visual presentation is stylized and stylistic. It's controlled and artificial. It's edited. There are special effects. The acting might be over the top. There might be big, elaborate set pieces, costumes, CGI, etc. And these films draw attention to themselves as films. Look what I can do because I am a film. I can have big, intense action scenes and rotating cameras and big, beautiful dresses and all sorts of interesting things that only a film could do because everyday life does not look quite like that. Now, most films fall in the middle of those two things, and classical Hollywood films especially were at the center of that spectrum, where they used realism and they used formalism to create a visual world that's believable but beautiful at the same time. So most films do both of these things. And we're going to get more into realism and formalism later this semester, but I just wanted to bring it up now so we could start thinking about how visual design and different visual styles tell us information about characters, about stories, about the message of a film. So I did want to show a couple examples of different visual styles. If you go to week 3 clips, images, and links in Canvas, there are a couple pictures here that I'm going to show as examples. Okay, so this first image here at the top of the page is taken from the German Expressionist film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. German Expressionism is a type of formalist film production that was intended to take kind of human emotions and make those visible through objective reality, taking fear and uneasiness and discomfort and making those ideas or those emotions visible through architecture, angles, shading, color. And you'll notice that the backgrounds here are weird angles and dark and just unusual and kind of uncanny. And that's intended to make the viewer feel a certain way through the use of visual design. So a newer form of formalism is, American indie film formalism. This image here is taken from the film But I'm a Cheerleader, which we'll be watching this week in class. And you'll notice that the use of color and composition are very unusual here. This doesn't really reflect what we would expect this real world setting to look like. In terms of how the monochromatic blue and pops of pink stand out to the viewer, in terms of how the characters are positioned within the frame, it just does not reflect reality in a way that we would typically expect. The next image here is taken from the Tim Burton film Alice in Wonderland, and I would say that this is also a form of, or a type of Hollywood formalism. The layering of colors of visual imagery, the unusual kind of shapes and density of the image, combined with the dark kind of brooding sky in the background, is very much an example of Tim Burton's very specific style of visual design. But again, this is not what we would expect from a real world objective reality. This is very fantastical and formalistic. Now, realism, and specifically Italian neorealism, which is kind of a subgenre from the 1940s and 50s, is all about something that you could see in the real world. So you'll see these two characters here from The Bicycle Thief. Their clothing is very kind of shabby and run down. The setting seems to be just an everyday street. This is something you could imagine actually viewing in the real world. And British social realism tends to focus on slightly different kind of topics and themes, but very similar in terms of visual design. The clothing that the character wears seems like something you would expect like a teenage girl to wear. The background is kind of shabby and run down. The empty bottles and the torn wallpaper look like a space you could actually sort of envision. And then the next image is taken from the 2010 film Winter's Bone starring Jennifer Lawrence. You'll notice that the clothing she's wearing, the lack of kind of obvious or overt makeup, and the setting all also point to a real world sort of narrative. Now, the last thing I've included here are a couple links, and these links help show that formalism and realism are not necessarily tied to specific genres. So, Heaven is a Traffic Jam on the 405 is a documentary film that uses a formalist filmmaking style, and The Road is a science fiction dystopian film that uses a realistic style. So, please do watch those two clips when you have a moment.